It's vastly important because, bringing them up to my next story here regarding energy and the crisis that we have a massive energy crisis that is taking place because our grids aren't being updated. They're not being able to obtain the amount of energy that Americans are using, which is why we have these rolling blackouts all the time, every single year across the United States, or they're throttling down your energy usage. Many of you in California, specifically Southern California, where I live, see that every single day in the summer, where we're constantly getting throttled by our own government in terms of how much electricity we're using. Mind you, we're paying for it. Okay, if I want to crank that sucker to whatever I want, if I'm paying for it, you better not be throttling it down. But no, they don't want to update the grids. They don't want to do anything. They don't want to spend your taxpayer dollars in the right place. They want to put these freaking wind turbines out in the ocean that are going to do jack shit for you rather than building a freaking nuclear power plant that's going to actually sustain what we need. And like I said, Pete Buttigieg is completely baffled in terms of how much energy is utilized by these electric vehicles and how it's going to cost the American taxpayer more money with these solar and wind turbines in place, and to meet the demand from the electric grid isn't necessarily possible in the time frame that Joe Biden wants to implement all this crap. Without further ado, let's react to this bad boy here.
Secretary Buttigieg, I've been driving an electric car for 10 years, and I've had solar panels for 15 years, and I'm really bullish on technology and the way it could help make our country energy independent, or more energy independent. But I'm really alarmed at sort of the naivete of those who are promoting rapid adoption of these technologies with our existing infrastructure. President Biden signed a non-binding executive order stating that 50% of vehicles sold in the United States should be electric by 2030. Do you support that?
Yes.
Of course he does.
And he also said that by 2035 that 100% of the federal government fleet should be electric. Do you support that?
Yes.
So which uses more electricity? We're talking about residential electricity.
I want to point out, and as always, folks, me pausing it throughout the video. One, I don't want to get hit with a copyright infringement. Furthermore, we're a commentary conservative outlet, so I want to give my commentary on this. Him just going, yes, just shows that he doesn't understand jack crap about any of this. He will claim that he does, and I'm sure he knows a little bit of information, but the amount of understanding and research that goes into this, it is baffling that you would be on board with something like this. But we see this time and time again from the progressive left, the Democrat Party as well, on wanting to push the power of the federal government upon the American citizens as well as private industry to force their agenda on everybody else, when not everybody else, one, wants to meet it in that time frame, two, can't meet it in that time frame, and three, the federal government themselves that's pushing it upon everybody can't meet it in that time frame, but they're still going to trot this crap out. Wait till you get all the information, the specifics here.
Electricity here, a refrigerator when it's running or an electric car when it's charging in your garage?
I would expect a car.
Would you say it uses twice as much or 25 times as much?
I would think closer to 25 times as much. Yeah.
It's actually 50 at the instantaneous moment, but over the course of a year, if I take the numbers from the U.S. Department of Energy about the average household, how many vehicles they own and how far they drive, over the course of a year, an American household would use 25 times as much electricity for their electric cars they would for their refrigerator if they had 100% adoption. If and the average family has two vehicles, and this would be if the average family had two electric vehicles. Do you think it would strain the grid if everybody plugged in 25 refrigerators in every household?
Well, if we didn't make any upgrades to the grid, sure. I mean, if we had yesterday's grid with tomorrow's cars, it's not going to work. It's one of the reasons why we believe that infrastructure includes electrical infrastructure, and argued for that to be included, as it thankfully was in the bipartisan law.
It's just a bunch of pandering to his base. At no point is he going to explain how those upgrades are going to be done. And even if we have those upgrades and looking at the trajectory of them, will they meet the demand that this gentleman here is talking about from the Republican side of the aisle? Are those upgrades actually going to happen by 2030? Are they going to be able to meet the demand that you want to be able to be met? I don't think it's going to happen, and it sure as hell is not going to happen with wind and solar, folks. No way in hell.
Do you think by 2030, which is when Biden says 50% of cars sold should be electric, do you think the grid will be capable of handling electric cars?
It's going to need to be, and we're working with the Department of Energy every day. We've established a joint office of energy and transportation to map out some of the needs. Obviously, some of this gets outside of my lane, and we've been discussing with, for example, the truck stops that are looking at what their power needs would need to be at an interchange where today they're mainly filling up on gas in order to accommodate that. And then, as you mentioned, a lot of the scenario for this is also residential. But it's also worth pointing out that while a typical driver who adopts electric is using more electricity, at the end of the day, they're using less energy because of the efficiency benefits of getting that energy produced at utilities.
The problem is we don't have the capacity to produce that energy. You aptly use the word need. You could say want as well. There's needs and wants to make this fantasy work by 2030. But the reality is the capability is not going to be there.
Exactly right. And I love that frame from this Republican of Kentucky. Just call it a fantasy. And here's the issue also in this conversation, this exchange between a Republican and a Democrat. We see this a lot of times in our conversations with the left, the progressive left, or the Democrat Party, is they have these fantasies, they don't live in reality, and that they want to push this agenda on the American people, whether it's the gender identity agenda, the LGBTQ plus agenda, the abortion agenda, whatever the agenda is, the climate crisis, immigration. I mean, they're constantly pushing this stuff on the American people, this fantasy they want, but they never talk about how you're going to pay for it. And if they are going to talk about implementing it and not talk about how you're going to pay for it, the very implementation they're going to do is not going to meet their fantasy that they're trying to impose upon all of us. So it's just, it's mind-blowing how illogical a lot of these agendas are. And that's why I say I'm starting to get very suspicious with things in terms of where all this money is going. Whose pocket is it going to? Because we've been talking about this for freaking decades, well before I've even been alive. You've had billions and billions of dollars being thrown at this. Nothing has changed, right? You've been talking about that there's going to be an ice age, then there's a global warming, then you change it to climate change. The conversation continues to go and go and go around, spending more taxpayer dollars on this fantasy that they're trying to push. Again, I'm not discrediting the fact that if you want to push this climate change stuff, fine. But if you're going to do it, at least make the argument feasible and not basically a fantasy. I don't even know if fantastical is a word, but you understand what I'm saying is at least can we have the discussion about nuclear power here? And they're not willing to have the discussion because they've seen Chernobyl. And people think, oh, well, millions of people died in Chernobyl. No, I mean, at most, you're talking in a few hundreds at most. The direct cause of it, I think there was like 38 deaths. And then you look at what happened in Japan. And the people that were a direct cause of Japan is minimal. I'm not saying it's great. I'm not saying it's great what happened. But in Japan, an earthquake is what caused that. Here in America, the most tech-savvy nation in the world can implement nuclear power in a safe way, and we've done so. So I just want the Democrat Party to wake up, and those that are watching this to wake up as well in terms of energy. If we want clean, renewable energy, nuclear power is the way to go. Wind and solar isn't. I'm not saying you can't still utilize solar on houses. I'm not saying any of that. We could still utilize it, but them saying that that's going to meet the demands and meet the demands of this 2030 initiative that Joe Biden wants, as well as a 2050 initiative that he wants, is just not feasible. It's asinine.
The average household uses 17% of their electricity for air conditioning. And that would mean the average household uses 1,870 kilowatt hours per year for air conditioning. If that average household plugged in electric cars, do you know how much more electricity they would use in comparison to the air conditioning that air conditions their whole house?
No, but again, I would emphasize it will
let
be
me help
less
you. Let me help you
overall.
with that first before we go on, because the numbers are important. It would take 4 times as much electricity to charge the average household's cars as the average household uses on air conditioning. Do you think that could be? So if we reach the goal by 2030 that Biden has of 50% adoption instead of 100% adoption, that means the average household would use twice as much electricity charging one of their cars as they would use for all of the air conditioning that they use for the entire year. Do you think this could contribute to rolling blackouts and brownouts in areas of the country where air conditioning is basically considered essential?
Not if we prepare. Look, the fact that people who have electric vehicles are going to use more electricity can't be a reason to give up. The idea that America is inferior to the other countries that have figured this out just doesn't sit well with us in administration, and that's why we're investing in a better grid.
In the time that I have left, let me say, I'm not saying we shouldn't prepare. I told you at the beginning of this, I'm bullish on this technology, but the numbers and the rate of adoption has been developed using political science, not engineering. They're impractical. And if we blindly follow these goals that Biden has set out, it will cause pain and suffering for the middle class. And I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
So you have this conversation being had, right, between Democrats and Republicans on the climate crisis. There is an agenda where we could meet in the middle, because I don't want my electricity to be throttled. Furthermore, I want electric cars to be utilized. I do think it's good for an environment. Everybody wants to breathe clean air. Everybody wants a better environment. We all live on this planet together. We want that to happen. But how do we get there is where we deviate. Furthermore, when you have this conversation between a Republican and Democrat, one is talking numbers. The other one is talking basically on emotion, right? It's a fantasy. He doesn't want to talk about numbers. He doesn't want to talk the numbers on how to get there and actually be realistic. He just wants to talk about the idea. Remember, when these climate change alarmists are having these conversations, they literally think they're going to die in the next 10 years from climate change. So imagine that. Imagine you put yourself in a different situation where you think you're literally going to die, and you're trying to have a conversation with somebody else that's talking about numbers. Oh, well, realistically, you're going to have about, 99.95% chance of living and all these things. No, you're not getting it. We need to shut down everything. I think you see where I'm going with this, of COVID-19. There's this hysteria on things where people think they're going to die. They think that other people's going to cause them to die. And so they go after it on a pure emotional standpoint and don't actually use reason and logic behind what they're thinking. They just want to espouse a bunch of nonsense. And that's what we're seeing from the Democrat Party here, where the Republican side's looking at the data, understanding what's being done in an emotional aspect, and wanting to solve the issue, but they just want to freak out and be fanatical about everything and not actually resolve it in a realistic manner. I hope you enjoyed that clip from the Bald Brad Show. If you did, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you can stay up to date on all our future content.